The black gloves were too tight. Eleanor had borrowed them from Mrs. Hartwell's housemaid 3 hours ago, along with a set of ivory buttons for her collar and a quiet understanding that she would return both before supper. The gloves were a size too small. By the time the wedding procession began, she could feel every seam pressing into her knuckles like a reminder she had no business being here. She sat in the last pew of St. Margaret's, the one closest to the side door. The one that nobody chose unless they intended to leave early or had never been meant to stay. The church smelled of hothouse lilies and beeswax and the particular kind of prosperity that announced itself without effort. Morning light came through the stained glass in long amber columns and landed on the shoulders of people who belonged to it. Eleanor kept her eyes on the order of service card in her lap. She had come because Lady Ashworth's invitation had been addressed to Mrs. E. Grey, companion to the Hartwell household, and Mrs. Grey did not exist in any official record. Which meant no one should have recognized her. She had come because she had not been outside of the Hartwell townhouse in 11 days. She had come, if she was honest with herself, because she had forgotten what it felt like to sit somewhere that was not a schoolroom or a servant's corridor. And for one morning she had wanted to pretend that the world had not entirely closed its doors. She understood now that this had been a mistake. That it began with the woman 2 pews ahead. A whisper, turned just slightly too loud in the way that whispers in churches often are. "That's the Valrick girl. Isn't it Colonel's daughter?" And then the half-turn, the assessment, the conclusion rendered in a single sweep of someone else's eyes. "Poor thing. Still clinging to whatever this is." The woman beside her shifted. A small, precise movement, the kind that said, "I did not choose to sit next to this," without requiring words. On her other side, the aisle remained clear. Eleanor watched the light move across the stone floor and kept her hands folded and thought about the side door and whether she could reach it before the processional began. She could. If she stood now, before the organ, before the bridesmaids, before anyone had to watch her leave, she stood, and a shadow fell across the pew that he was standing at the end of the row, not walking past, not pausing accidentally, but standing with the particular stillness of someone who had chosen exactly where to be. Tall, dark coat. The kind of face that had been arranged by good breeding into something that gave nothing away. His eyes were gray-blue. And they were looking at her the way people looked at something they had been searching for long enough that finding it required a moment of adjustment. Eleanor did not know him. She was certain of that. She had made it her occupation for 5 years to know which faces she needed to avoid. And this face was not in that catalogue. But something in the quality of his attention made her stay very still. He stepped into the pew. Sat down beside her, not at the far end, not at a polite distance, but close enough that the sleeve of his coat nearly touched her arm. The woman who had shifted away from Eleanor went very rigid. Then he leaned toward her. And his voice was low enough that it existed only in the space between them. "Pretend you're mine." Eleanor stopped breathing, before she could process the words or the fact that a stranger had just said them into her ear. He had straightened. He looked across the pew at Lady Harwick, the woman who had turned to assess her, the woman whose whisper had started all of it, and he nodded once. A gesture so precisely calibrated in its authority that it functioned as both greeting and silencing. "Lady Harwick." His voice was quiet and unhurried. "You appear to be staring at my fiancé." The church had a particular acoustic quality. The words carried. Eleanor did not look at Lady Harwick. She looked at the order of service card in her lap and observed, distantly, that her hands had stopped shaking. The organ began. The carriage was a Blackwood carriage. She knew this because the crest on the door was a variation of the one she had seen in illustrated newspapers. The kind that appeared beside words like Privy Council and Intelligence Apparatus and the Duke of Blackwood, whose appointment last spring, and she had stepped into it because the alternative had been standing on the church steps. While Lady Harwick recovered her voice, she sat across from him now. The city moved past the window in grey November light. "You know who I am?" she said. It was not a question. "Eleanor Valrick." He said it without inflection. "Currently employed as companion and governess to the Hartwell family. Before that, Mrs. Eleanor Morrow, wife of Baron Morrow of Shropshire. Before that, I know my own history." "Then you understand why I recognized you." she looked at him directly for the first time. The gray-blue eyes gave her the same quality of attention as before, deliberate, precise. The attention of someone accustomed to extracting information from whatever was in front of them. She had been looked at in many ways in the past 5 years. She knew the difference between contempt and calculation. This was calculation, and something else she couldn't name yet. What do you want? She said, the same thing you do. He settled back against the seat. A solution to an immediate problem. Why immediate problem and yours are not the same, they are more similar than you think. He reached into his coat and produced a folded newspaper. He opened it to a page near the back, a small note. CE, 4 lines, easy to miss if you weren't looking. She read it once, then again, reported, the daughter of the late Colonel T. Valric, convicted of treason in 1882. Believed to be residing in London under an assumed name. The Privy Council Intelligence Office has confirmed inquiries are ongoing. The Privy Council Intelligence Office. His office, she looked up, that notice ran this morning. He said. It will be picked up by 3 other papers by Thursday. By Friday, every household in Mayfair will know that Eleanor Gray and Eleanor Valric are the same person. The Hartwells will be asked to let you go. You will have no employment, no address. And a name that makes you unemployable in any household that reads the papers. He folded the notice and returned it to his coat. Which is all of them, the city continued past the window. Eleanor watched it. And you, she said. What is your immediate problem? I am required to present a suitable fiancé at a series of engagements beginning with a country house party at Blackwood Manor next week. The king has expressed his interest in my continued unmarried state in terms that do not leave room for continued delay. A pause. I require someone credible. So. Meon, who can occupy that position without requiring management. And someone whose particular circumstances make the arrangement mutually preferable to any alternative. You mean someone who has no other options? That I mean someone intelligent enough to understand the value of the arrangement. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street widened into the grey expanse of a November square, pigeons moving across the wet cobblestones in the indifferent way of creatures that had never needed to be anywhere in particular. If I agree, she said. What exactly are you offering? Blackwood Manor for the duration of the engagement. A monthly allowance. My name in social contexts, which will close the inquiries that are currently open. He looked at her steadily. And time for what? He did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice had the same quality as before, unhurried, precise, but something in it had shifted by a fraction she couldn't quite identify. Time is a resource. What you do with it is your own concern. That it was not an answer. She understood. With the particular instinct of someone who had spent 5 years reading rooms and people and the spaces between words, that it was also not nothing. The Hartwells expect me back by 4. She said, "You'll have your things collected." That I didn't say yes, you haven't said no. The carriage moved through the square. Eleanor looked at the pigeons on the cobblestones, at the grey light on the wet stone, at the newspaper folded inside his coat. One condition. She said that he waited. You don't lie to me. She met his eyes. Whatever this is, whatever you actually want from this arrangement, you don't lie to me about it. You can decline to tell me things. But you don't lie. Something moved across his face. It was brief enough that she almost missed it. And she had the impression, immediate and unexplained, that she had said something that landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to reach. Agreed, he said, outside. A church bell began to count the hour. Eleanor looked at her hands in the too tight borrowed gloves and thought about a name she hadn't let herself use in 5 years, Valric. That he had said it in the church like it was simply a name. Like it was hers. She looked up. Then yes. She said. I agree. Blackwood Manor announced itself before the carriage reached the gates. That it was the kind of house that had been built to remind people of something, the particular permanence of families who had never needed to explain themselves. 3 stories of pale stone, symmetrical windows. Grounds that extended far enough in every direction that the edges disappeared into November grey. Eleanor had grown up in a house with a name. She understood the grammar of such places. She also understood that understanding the grammar did not make you a native speaker. The carriage stopped. AFO. Othman opened the door. She stepped out into cold air and the particular silence of a house that had been waiting. The Duchess of Blackwood was standing at the top of the entrance steps. She was perhaps 60. Dressed in the precise colors of someone who had never needed to make concessions to fashion because fashion had always come to her. She looked at Eleanor the way that certain women of a certain generation looked at problems they had not anticipated, with an expression of absolute composure that contained, just beneath its surface, the implication that the problem would shortly be made to understand its own inconvenience. Adrian. She addressed the Duke without looking at him. You might have sent word that I sent word yesterday, he said. You chose not to acknowledge it. A pause of 2 seconds precise, waited. Then the Duchess transferred her attention to Eleanor, and her expression shifted into something that wore the shape of warmth. My dear, she said. What a difficult journey that must have been. Do come in. The drawing room held 4 women besides the Duchess. Eleanor catalogued them in the time it took to cross from the door to the offered chair. 2 were daughters of earls, 1 was a viscount's widow of recent vintage, and 1 the youngest, positioned nearest the fire with the ease of someone accustomed to the best chair in any room. She did not immediately place. Tea was poured. The Duchess asked about the journey. The viscount's widow asked about the wedding. The journey had been fine. The wedding had been lovely. Eleanor answered in the register she had spent 5 years perfecting present enough to be courteous, unremarkable enough to invite no further inquiry. Then the Duchess set down her cup. We were so saddened, she said, in the tone of someone about to say something that would not be sad at all, to hear about your husband's passing. Baron Morrow, wasn't it? A small estate in Shropshire. I don't believe I ever had the pleasure. He was a private man, Eleanor said. Of course. A pause. And before that, forgive me. I have such a poor memory for these things. Your family name was Valric, I believe. Colonel Valric's daughter. The room adjusted. Not Ludley. No one moved. No one gasped. But there was a quality of attention that sharpened in the way that attention sharpens when people who have been pretending not to listen stop pretending. Yes. Eleanor said, dreadful business. The Duchess shook her head with great sorrow. For the family especially. A father's sins are such a burden for the children. Though of course a gentle smile, one can always rise above one's origins. Can't one? With the right guidance. Eleanor held her teacup. The china was very thin, the kind that showed light through it. One tries, she said. The youngest woman by the fire spoke for the first time. I imagine it must be lonely, she said. Not having much family to speak of. No connections to speak of either, I suppose. It must make everything rather provisional. The word was chosen well. It meant, you are here on sufferance. It meant, nothing you have is permanent. It meant all of this while appearing to mean nothing at all. I find I manage, Eleanor said. The Duchess smiled. Of course you do, she said. You've had so much practice. Dinner was served at 8. The table seated 14. Eleanor was placed at the Duke's right hand, which she understood was both a courtesy and a form of exposure, visible to everyone, adjacent to the house's center of gravity, impossible to overlook. She had dressed in the best of the 3 gowns she had brought, a deep blue that Mrs. Hartwell had once said suited her. And she had pinned her hair without a maid's assistance and arrived at the table 30 seconds before the Duke. Which meant she had been required to stand beside her chair and wait while the room assessed her. She was accustomed to being assessed. She kept her spine straight and her hands still and looked at the floral arrangement in the center of the table, which was very large and therefore useful. The Duke sat. Dinner began. For the first 3 courses, the conversation stayed on politics, the shooting season, and a matter involving the reorganization of the Home Office that seemed to generate strong feelings. Eleanor ate and listened and spoke when addressed and did not volunteer anything. Across the table, the Duchess watched her with the serene attention of someone who had not yet decided how to proceed. It was Lord Ashby, a baronet of 50, seated 4 places down, who provided the opening. Miss Valric, he said. Not Mrs. Morrow. Not Mrs. Gray. Miss Valrick. The usage was deliberate. She could see it in the small smile that accompanied it. I wonder your father was in the intelligence corps before his appointment to the general staff, wasn't he? I believe Blackwood had some involvement with that branch at the time. He glanced toward the Duke with pleasant curiosity. Quite a coincidence. Isn't it? How you two came to find each other. The table went quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone will pretend not to have noticed. Eleanor looked at Lord Ashby. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had thrown a stone into water. Aaron was curious about the ripples. Then why father's career was not something he discussed at the dinner table, she said. I'm afraid I wouldn't be much use as a source of coincidences. No, I imagine not. He reached for his wine. Though one does wonder. Doesn't one how much a daughter knows about a father's activities? Whether certain tendencies run in families. The word tendencies did the work of 3 sentences. Eleanor set down her fork. She did it quietly, without emphasis. The way you put something down when you intend to give your full attention to what comes next. But she did not speak, because Adrian Blackwood had placed his own fork on the table, and the sound of its small, deliberate contact of silver on white linen had a quality that caused Lord Ashby to look toward the head of the table, and caused 3 other conversations to cease. Ashby. The Duke's voice was the same as it always was, unhurried. Carrying the precision of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. You're referring to the Valrick case, well. In general terms. In general terms. The Duke reached for his water glass. The Valrick case is under active review by the Privy Council Intelligence Committee. Has been for some time. Any conclusions reached prior to the completion of that review are a pause, brief as a door closing. Premature. He looked at Lord Ashby with the mild attentiveness of someone explaining something simple to someone who should already understand it. Tendencies, as you put it, are not evidentiary. I'd have thought a man of your experience in the courts would know that. Lord Ashby's smile had not disappeared, but it had become effortful. Of course. He said. I meant nothing by it that I am certain you didn't. The table resumed. Someone asked about the shooting season. Someone else answered. Eleanor looked at the floral arrangement in the center of the table and became aware, with a slowness that had something to do with the careful way she was breathing, that the thing she was feeling was not relief. She had been defended before. By lawyers she hadn't chosen, by women who pitied her, by men who wanted something. She knew the grammar of that. To the performance of advocacy that cost the performer nothing and left the defended person exactly where they'd started. Only slightly more indebted. This had not felt like that. The Valrick case is under active review. He had not said she is blameless. He had not said her father was a good man. He had used the precise language of the institution he controlled. And he had used it to turn a room's worth of implication back onto the person who had made it. And he had done it without raising his voice or altering his expression or appearing to do anything other than state a fact. She looked at him. He was speaking to the man on his left about something unrelated. Already past it. Tendencies are not evidentiary. She thought about the carriage. About the way he had said time and then stopped. She thought about the gray-blue eyes and the church, the way they had looked at her like they were confirming something. She looked back at the floral arrangement and understood that she had made an error in her initial assessment of this arrangement. She had believed she understood what he wanted. She was no longer certain that was true. Across the table, the Duchess watched her with an expression that had, for the first time that evening, become genuinely thoughtful. She found the garden by accident at 5:30 in the morning. Sleep had become unreliable since the Hartwell household. Too many years of listening for the sounds that meant someone needed something. Too many years of being the person whose rest was the first thing sacrificed when the house required adjusting. She had lain in the guest room at Blackwood Manor and watched the ceiling and listened to the November wind against the windows until it became clear that the ceiling had nothing useful to offer. The garden was reached through a door at the end of the east corridor that she had assumed was a closet. It opened instead onto a stone path and the grey pre-dawn smell of wet grass and something that might have been boxwood. She had brought her shawl and not much else. And the cold was immediate and clarifying. She had been outside for perhaps 10 minutes when she realized she was not alone, that he was standing near the fountain at the garden center, not walking, not pacing. Simply standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his face turned toward the east where the sky was beginning to separate itself from the darkness in bands of deep gray. He hadn't heard her. She could have gone back inside, she didn't. Her footsteps on the stone path were quiet but not silent. He turned before she reached him. Of course he did, she thought. A man in his position had probably stopped being surprised years ago. You couldn't sleep either. She said. It wasn't a question that I rarely do. He looked back toward the horizon. The manor is worse than London. Too quiet. The silence has a texture here. She came to stand a few feet away from him, close enough for conversation, far enough to be unambiguous about what this was. Two people in a garden before dawn who had nowhere else to be. The fountain had been turned off for winter, the basin dry, leaves collected in its bottom in a way that suggested no one had cleared them in some time. You grew up here. She said, until I was 12. Then school. Then London. A pause. I don't think I ever entirely learned how to be in this house. She looked at him. In the gray light, without the dinner table's candles and the requirement to perform a particular version of himself, he looked different, not younger. Exactly, but less finished. Like a sentence that hadn't decided on its punctuation. The Privy Council review, she said. The one you mentioned at dinner. Is it real? He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. There is a review. He said. It has been ongoing for some time. How long? Another pause. Shorter this time. 2 years. She looked at the dry fountain and said nothing. 2 years was not a thing you said casually. 2 years was a decision you made and kept making, quietly, in rooms where no one was watching. Why? She said that. He turned his head slightly, not quite toward her. In profile, the gray-blue of his eyes caught what light there was. Because 5 years ago I made a judgment based on information I had verified through my own network, and 3 months after I made that judgment, 6 men who had trusted that network were killed in an ambush that the network should have predicted. He stopped. The wind moved through the boxwood. The information was compromised. I have been trying to determine where and how ever since Eleanor was still, and my father's case. She said carefully, used the same network. The same period. The same. He stopped again. When he continued. His voice had the quality of a door being held open by effort rather than ease. There are patterns that concern me. That is all I can tell you at present. That is all I can tell you at present. Not that is all there is. She heard the difference. She looked at him, really looked. The way she had trained herself not to do with people she needed something from. Because looking clearly was a vulnerability she couldn't always afford. He was watching the horizon with the expression of a man who had been carrying something for long enough that he had forgotten it was possible to put it down. She had seen that expression before. She owned it herself. You said. You don't lie, she said. At dinner. When you stopped Ashby. You said the case was under active review. It is, but you didn't say why. Or how long. Or what you found. No, you declined to tell me things. She said. That was the agreement. Yes. She pulled her shawl tighter against the cold and looked at the gray-pink edge of the sky where the sun was beginning to make its intentions known. There was a quality to standing here. In this dry garden with this man who was carrying something he wouldn't name, that felt unexpectedly familiar. Not comfortable. Familiar in the way that recognizing a pattern was familiar, the slight internal adjustment of I have been here before. In a different version of this place. My father wrote me a letter, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. Before the execution. They allowed him 3 pages. He used most of it explaining things I was too young to understand at the time about the army, about the work had done. About why certain records had been kept the way they were. She paused. He mentioned a man with gray-blue eyes who had come to collect documents from his office in the week before his arrest. He said the man had looked at him in a way he couldn't explain. Like the man already knew something my father didn't. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences before it. She did not look at him. She was not ready to look at him. That I never knew who that was. She said. I used to think about it. Whether that man had known what was coming. Whether he could have. She stopped. It doesn't matter now, Eleanor. His voice was different. Something in it had shifted in a way she couldn't fully characterize. Quieter, or more careful. Or simply less offended than it had been before. She looked up. He was watching her with the gray-blue eyes that her father had apparently found worth mentioning in his last 3 pages. And his expression was the expression of a man who had just had a door he thought was closed open from the other side. The review will be complete before the new year, he said. That is what I can tell you. She held that. Let it sit, then I suppose, she said. We have until the new year. He looked at her for a moment longer, that same quality of attention as in the church, confirming something, and then he looked back at the horizon. The sun came up. They stood in the garden and watched it, and neither of them said anything else. And the silence that time had the texture of something that had been waiting for longer than either of them had known. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor knew it was significant because of how it was delivered, not through the normal household post. Not left on the silver tray in the entry hall with the estate correspondence, but brought directly to the Duke by a man who had arrived on horseback in the rain and departed without taking tea. She saw this from the upstairs landing, where she had been returning from the library with 3 books she had selected for no reason except that the library was the only room in Blackwood Manor where no one required her to be anything. She did not ask about the letter. She was learning the architecture of what could and could not be asked. In this house. The Duke's silences had geography. Some of them were simply him thinking, some of them were him deciding, and some of them were walls. She had begun to be able to tell the difference. That evening, at dinner, there were only 4 at the table: the Duke, Eleanor, the Duchess, and a man introduced as Mr. Croft, Lord Croft, actually, of the Intelligence Committee. Just passing through, who had the kind of face that had been constructed to appear unremarkable. Forgettable eyes. A voice pitched at exactly the register that slid past attention. Eleanor noticed him immediately. She noticed him because of the way he looked at her when she entered the room. A single assessment, rapid and complete, that he then thoroughly disguised under a pleasant expression of social neutrality. She had been assessed that way before, but not often. Usually by people in her father's world. The world of files and networks and careful, deniable knowledge. She took her seat and was pleasant and unremarkable throughout the soup. During the fish course, Lord Croft turned to her with the expression of a man making polite conversation. Miss Valrick, he said. And the use of her real name in that pleasant voice was itself a kind of instrument. I understand you've been staying at the manor for some weeks now. You must be finding it very different from your previous situation. Every situation is different from the last. She said, quite so. He reached for his wine. I knew your father, you know. Peripherally. In the course of professional matters. A smile. He was a very capable man. It was such a shame. The waste of it. She held her fork and said nothing. I've always thought, Lord Croft continued pleasantly, that the tragedy of such cases is not the man himself but the residual uncertainty, shall we say. Whether everything was found. Whether all the damage was contained. His eyes moved to hers, briefly. With precision. Whether certain materials that may have been in a family's possession were ever properly accounted for. The table continued around them. The Duke was speaking to the Duchess about the estate accounts. The footman moved behind the chairs. Lord Croft looked at his wine. Do pass my regards to your household staff, he said pleasantly. It must be such a comfort, having people around who know how to keep things in order. He turned back to the general conversation. Eleanor set her fork down quietly. Her father's letter was in the lining of her traveling case, sewn into a pocket she had made herself with a needle borrowed from Mrs. Hartwell's sewing room. 3 years ago, the night after the second time someone had searched her room without finding it, she looked at the floral arrangement in the center of the table. Then she looked at Adrian Blackwood, who was listening to the Duchess discuss the accounts, and who had not, in the past 4 minutes, once looked in her direction, but his right hand, resting beside his wine glass, had closed into a stillness that was not relaxation that he had heard every word, after dinner. In the hallway outside the drawing-room, while the Duchess was occupied with Lord Croft's departure, the Duke came to stand beside her for a moment under the pretext of examining a painting neither of them was looking at. "What did he say to you?" "He said quietly that he asked about materials that might have been in my father's possession," she said, equally quiet. "He was very pleasant about it." A pause. "Stay close to the house tomorrow," he said. "Don't go into the village alone." She looked at the painting. "A pastoral scene, cows in a field." "Utterly uninformative. You knew he was coming," she said. "That I suspected, and you didn't tell me that. I didn't want to alarm you before it was necessary." She was quiet for a moment. In the room behind them, Lord Croft was saying his goodbyes. And his voice carried the same pleasant unremarkability as before, and she thought about her father's letter in its sewn pocket, and about grey blue eyes, and about 2 years of quiet review that she had not known about until 4 days ago. "You should have told me." She said that he didn't answer. But when she walked past him toward the stairs, she heard him, very quietly, say, "Yes. I should have." The annual Blackwood winter reception was, by any measure, the most significant social event the manor hosted. Eleanor understood this from the way the household transformed in the 3 days preceding it, additional staff arriving from London, the flowers ordered in quantities that suggested the house was being prepared for a state occasion. The Duchess moving through every room with the focused energy of a general who had been planning this campaign for months. 40 guests were expected. Several had travelled from London specifically. The Intelligence Committee would be represented. 3 members of the Lords would attend. She dress Ed carefully. The blue gown again. She had only 3. And this was the best, with her hair pinned in the style she'd learned to do herself during the years when there had been no maid and no money for one. She looked at herself in the mirror and made the adjustments available to her and went downstairs. The Duke was waiting in the entry hall. He looked at her for a moment with the measuring quality she had come to recognize as his version of assessment, then offered his arm without comment. "Lady Fenwick will try to seat you near the windows," he said quietly as they moved toward the drawing-room. "The acoustics there carry in both directions. Whatever you say will be heard at the main cluster of chairs. And whatever they say there will reach you. You're telling me to be careful. That I am telling you the layout." A pause. "Being careful is implied," she almost smiled. Noted. The room was already half full. She felt the shift in attention as they entered the particular adjustment of a room that has been waiting for something to arrive and has now decided how to receive it. Some of the faces she recognized from the dinner. Others were new. All of them, in the first 3 seconds, looked at her and then looked away in the manner of people who intended to discuss what they had seen at the earliest opportunity. She kept her spine straight and looked pleasant and stayed close enough to the Duke's left side to be unambiguously placed without appearing to require placement. For the first hour, it was manageable. Then Lady Fenwick, who was, as predicted, attempting to migrate the conversation toward the window cluster, said, across a group of 7 people, in a voice pitched at exactly the register that carried, "I was just saying to Croft this morning that it's remarkable, isn't it, how the Valrick case keeps finding its way back into drawing rooms? One would have thought it was settled. 1882 was such a long time ago." The group of 7 became very attentive, "though I suppose," Lady Fenwick continued, helping herself to a glass from a passing tray, "when there are remainders it does tend to resurface. Daughters. And so on. One doesn't quite know where to look." She laughed lightly. Several people laughed with her. Eleanor stood 12 feet away and heard every word and kept her expression at pleasant neutrality and thought about the dry fountain in the garden and the 3 pages of her father's last letter. The word remainders which had been chosen, like provisional, with great care. She was composing a response, something measured, something that would close the conversation without escalating it, when Lord Ashby, emboldened by the previous evening, said, "I'd imagine the Privy Council review Blackwood mentioned at dinner is something of a courtesy. These things are never really reopened in any meaningful sense. Are they, Blackwood?" He looked toward the Duke with the pleasant certainty of a man who believed he was stating consensus. the room waited. Adrian Blackwood set down his glass. That it was a small action. Deliberate. The sound of it crystal on the side table. Quiet and final caused the nearest three conversations to pause in the way that sounds sometimes do when they carry more weight than their volume suggests. The review, he said, in the unhurried voice that Eleanor had come to understand was his most precise register, is not a courtesy. He looked at Ashby with the mild, total attention of a man who found the question genuinely unremarkable. 2 weeks ago, the primary witness in the original Valrick prosecution submitted a formal retraction of his 1882 testimony to the Intelligence Committee. This is a matter of record. The committee is aware. The relevant members of the Lords have been notified. A pause. I had assumed this was common knowledge by now. I apologize if I was mistaken. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room that has just had its floor moved. Lady Fenwick's glass was halfway to her lips. Lord Ashby had the expression of a man who had leaned on a wall that was no longer there. The 7 people in the window cluster looked at one another with the careful blankness of people recalculating. The Duke turned to Eleanor. That I should have mentioned this to you privately first, he said. His voice had shifted, still quiet, but directed only at her now, with a quality that the room could observe but not quite enter. I'm sorry. You should have heard it that way. She looked at him. The grey-blue eyes were steady and direct. Allow me to introduce her properly, he said, and he turned back to the room. And his voice carried to every corner of it without effort. This is Eleanor Valrick, daughter of Colonel Thomas Valrick, whose case is under formal review and whose reputation this committee takes seriously. He held the room's attention the way a man holds it when he has never needed to reach for it. She is my fiancée. I'd ask that you conduct yourselves accordingly. The room conducted itself accordingly. Later much a tear. When the guests had thinned and the fire had burned low and the Duchess had retired with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read, she found herself standing near the fireplace with a cup of tea that had gone cold and the particular interior stillness of someone who has just had something happen to them that they have not yet finished processing. She had heard her name said in public many times. It had meant many things. It had meant look at what fell and don't stand too close and imagine the nerve of her, being here. That it had not, before tonight, meant she is mine to speak for and she is worth speaking for. She turned the cold cup in her hands. Eleanor Valrick. Not Grey. Not Morrow. Not the Colonel's daughter, which was a label, not a name. Her name, in her father's shape. Given back to her in a room full of people who had been using it as a stone to throw. The fire shifted. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 11. She thought, I don't know what he wants. I don't know what he has. I don't know why he is doing this. Then she thought. But he knew the witness had retracted. He knew it before tonight. He has known things, and he has been moving them, quietly, for longer than I understand. The grey-blue eyes. The 2 years of review. The careful, deniable knowledge. She was missing something. She could feel its shape without being able to see it. She put the cold tea down and went to bed, and lay in the dark, and thought about what she was missing. And did not sleep. She had not intended to go into the study, she had intended to go to the library, third door on the left from the east staircase. She had memorized the route for something to read that was not her own thoughts. It was past midnight. The house was quiet in the heavy way that large houses are quiet when everyone in them has finally stopped performing. The library was the second door, she remembered too late. And her hand was already on the handle of the third when she realized the door was unlocked. It opened. The study was dark except for the lamp on the desk, which had been left burning not by the Duke. She saw immediately, the desk chair was empty. The room unoccupied. Someone had left in a hurry or intended to return. The lamp threw long shadows across the bookshelves and the large mahogany desk and the filing cabinet against the far wall, whose bottom drawer was not fully closed. She should have left. She crossed the room. The drawer had been opened recently. The papers inside were not in the neat arrangement she would have expected from the Duke's system. They were slightly displaced, as though someone had been through them and replaced them with less care than usual. She could see the edge of a folder, dark blue, The kind used for official Privy Council correspondence. She should not have touched it. She touched it, she pulled it out far enough to see the label on the front cover, and then she stopped, and the room became very still around her. Valric, T. Colonel. Royal Intelligence Corps. Treason. Conviction 1882. File Lead Officer, Blackwood. A. Blackwood. She stood in the lamplight and read the name on the cover again, and then a third time. In the way that you read something when you understand the words individually but the sentence refuses to mean what it means. File Lead Officer. He had built the case. He had gathered the evidence, verified the network. Assembled the documents that had sent her father to his death. The review he had mentioned, the 2 years of careful, quiet work, it had started from this desk. From this file. From the same hands that had originally closed it. She heard the door. She did not move. Eleanor. His voice was different than she had ever heard it. Not loud. Not urgent. Something stripped back in it. Like a sentence with its punctuation removed. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, without his coat, which meant he had come from somewhere nearby in haste. He looked at the folder in her hands, the folder she was still holding, she realized. She hadn't put it down, and he didn't attempt to explain or deflect. She looked at him across the room. You built the case, she said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when everything underneath them is not. You gathered the evidence. You verified the network. You signed the file. He came into the room. He didn't move toward her, stopped near the desk. Far enough that the space between them remained hers if she needed it. Yes, he said. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind, the witness who retracted. She said. The review that's been running for 2 years. The patterns that concern you. She looked at the folder and then at him. You've known all of this time. You knew when you found me. You knew when you sat down next to me in that church and said. She stopped. That I knew who you were. He said. Yes, did you know before the church? Before the wedding? A pause. I had been looking for you for some time. The folder was in her hands and the lamp was throwing shadows, and she was standing in his study at midnight holding the file that had killed her father and looking at the man whose name was on the cover. Why? She said. Not why did you build the case? Not why did you look for me? Just why, because there were too many questions with that shape and she needed to start somewhere, because 3 months after the Valric conviction, 6 men died in an ambush that the same network should have predicted. He said. And I spent 2 years telling myself the network had simply degraded. And then I spent another year not being able to make the mathematics work. And then I opened this file again. He looked at the folder. And I saw the things I had not let myself see the first time. What things? Inconsis. Tenses in the source documentation. Timestamps that don't align. A chain of custody that has 2 gaps I cannot account for. His voice was the same, unhurried. Precise, but there was something beneath it now that hadn't been there before. The quality of a door held open by effort. Someone built a case inside the case. They used my network, my verification. My signature. They made it look like mine because it was built from mine. And he stopped. She waited. That I didn't see it. He said. At the time. I verified what I was given and I signed what I had verified, and I told myself I had been thorough. The wind moved against the windows. The lamp threw its shadows. You knew before you found me. She said. That the case had problems. Yes, and you found me because. Because your father's letter exists. I knew he had written one. The prison chaplain's records reference it. And I knew that if there was a document in his handwriting from that period describing what he knew about the source materia, it would either confirm the inconsistencies or. He stopped again. I needed the letter, Eleanor. That was why I found you. The room was very quiet. She put the folder back in the drawer. She did it carefully. With the same precision she used for everything when she didn't trust her hands. She pushed the drawer closed, then she looked at him. You used me. She said. The arrangement. The church. All of it. You needed me for the letter. He didn't deny it. The arrangement was genuine. The protection was genuine. What I offered you was built on a foundation you didn't disclose. She felt something very cold and very steady moving through her. You said you wouldn't lie to me. You said you could decline to tell me things that I did not lie. She looked at him. You were very careful not to. He held her gaze. In the lamplight, the gray-blue of his eyes had a quality she couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly. Or not only guilt. Something older and more settled, like a weight he had been carrying so long he had stopped noticing it until this moment. Eleanor. I'd like to go to bed. She said. That he stepped aside from the doorway without a word. She walked out of the study and down the corridor and up the stairs and into the guest room, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held the shape of her father's name in her mind. Thomas Valrick. File lead officer at Blackwood, and felt the particular cold of understanding something you had suspected but had not let yourself suspect fully. She had been right, in the carriage. On that first day, she had not understood what he wanted. Now she did. She had decided to leave on Thursday, not dramatically. She had no capacity left for drama, and in any case dramatic departures required an audience willing to be affected. Which was not something she could count on in this house. She would simply pack her 3 gowns and her books and the traveling case with its sewn lining, and she would send a note to Mrs. Hartwell. And she would be gone before the house came fully awake. She had not yet told the Duke. She was composing the letter in the small writing desk in her room on Wednesday evening when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the Duke's, lighter than that. Stopping outside her door. A knock. She opened it to find Thomas, the youngest of the footmen, holding a folded note with the expression of someone who had been given specific instructions about its delivery. Come to the study. A.B. She nearly didn't go. She went. That he was standing at the window when she arrived. Which was unusual. Was almost always at the desk. The lamp was lit. The filing cabinet was closed, as was the blue folder she had last seen in her own hands. He turned when she entered but didn't sit down. Which meant this was not going to be conducted as a formal conversation. There is an event tomorrow evening, he said. A dinner at Hartley House. Croft will be there. I won't be here tomorrow evening, she said. That he looked at her. I've decided to leave. She said. I'll be gone in the morning. I'll send you the letter from London. I'll decline the arrangement formally. Whatever language is required for that. He was quiet for a moment. The dinner tomorrow is not my concern, Eleanor. He said her name the way he had said it in the study 2 nights ago, stripped of its formal quality. Reduced to its simplest form. Croft is planning to present new evidence at the dinner. Evidence he intends to use to close the Valrick review permanently. If he succeeds, the review is finished. The case stays as it is. She held the doorframe. What kind of evidence? Forged. I'm nearly certain of it. He has access to a forger who has worked for the committee before. I have reason to believe the same man produced the original source documentation in your father's case. He looked at her steadily. But I can't prove the forgery without establishing the forger's identity. And I can't establish the identity without a document that demonstrates the handwriting pattern. The letter, she said. If your father's letter contains references to the source material, dates, names, specific operational details, and if those references contradict the forged documentation, then I can present them side by side in front of the committee and force a direct comparison. He paused. But I need the letter before tomorrow evening. The corridor was quiet around them. Somewhere in the lower part of the house, the kitchen staff were finishing their evening work. She could hear distantly the sound of it. She looked at him. You're asking me to trust you, she said. With my father's last letter. With the only thing I have that is entirely mine. She didn't say you who built the case that killed him. She didn't need to. It was in the room with them. Yes. He said. I am, and if I give it to you and you fail. If Croft presents his evidence and the committee accepts it and the review is closed. What happens to the letter? It is returned to you. Whatever happens with the review, that's not what I'm asking. She looked at him directly. If you fail. If the review closes. What happens to my father's name? He held her gaze. He did not offer her comfort or probability or anything that would have been easier than the truth. Then it stays as it is, he said. For now. Until there is another way, for now. She understood. He was not promising her success. He was not offering her certainty. He was asking her to put the only thing she had left of her father into the hands of the man who had signed the file that ended him. On the basis of for now and until there is another way, she looked at the closed filing cabinet, then she went back to her room, she opened the traveling case and unpicked 3 stitches of the sewn pocket and took out the letter 3 pages in her father's handwriting. The paper soft with age and handling, and she brought it back to the study and placed it on the desk without a word that he looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I'll be at the dinner," she said. "If Croft is going to do this in public, I will be present when it doesn't work." She met his eyes. "That is not negotiable." "Understood." She turned to leave. "Eleanor," she stopped, "after tomorrow." He said. "Whatever the outcome, I will tell you everything. About the case. About what I found and when and how. Everything I declined to tell you." A pause. "You have my word." She stood in the doorway for a moment without turning around. "Your word," she said quietly, "is getting a great deal of work done in this arrangement." She left. Hartley House was 3 miles from the manor. The carriage ride was 20 minutes of silence, which was not uncomfortable in the way that silences sometimes are, but simply the silence of 2 people who had run out of the particular kind of speech available to them and had not yet found another kind. The Duke sat across from her. The letter was in the inside pocket of his coat. She was weary. In the blue gown, again, for what she calculated was the last time before it needed pressing she couldn't afford. Hartley House held 30 for dinner. Lord Croft was at the head of the secondary table, positioned with the ease of a man who had decided in advance where he would be standing when the room changed shape. He greeted her arrival with a pleasant smile that contained, she now understood, the exact same precision it had always contained. "Miss Valrick," he said. "I'm so glad you could come." She smiled back with the expression she had spent 5 years perfecting for rooms exactly like this one. "Lord Croft." "What a pleasure." Dinner proceeded. During the fish course, Croft produced a document from his jacket, theatrical in its timing, casual in its manner, and passed it to the man on his left, who happened to be Sir Edmund Graves of the Intelligence Committee. "Just a small matter," Croft said pleasantly. "Something that came to light this week regarding the Valrick Review. I thought the committee should see it before any further investments were made in that direction." Sir Edmund read it. His expression shifted. The document moved around the secondary table. Eleanor watched it travel. She watched the faces of the men who read its slight recalibration, the glances toward the Duke, the glances toward her. She kept her expression still and her hands in her lap and breathed slowly. She knew what they were reading. She knew it was forged. She also knew that she was the only person at this table who understood that the Duke had her father's letter in his coat, and that the letter would contradict every word of the document currently moving around the table, and that Croft had no idea. Lord Croft looked at her with the pleasant expression of a man closing a door. "I imagine this must be difficult," he said, "to have had such hopes for the review. Sometimes these things simply don't resolve the way we'd like." She looked at him. "How kind of you to say so," she said. At the head of the primary table, the Duke set down his fork. The sound carried. "Graves," he said, "before the committee draws any conclusions from that document, I'd like to present something for comparison." He reached into his coat. He placed the letter on the table beside his plate with the same unhurried precision he used for everything. "This is a letter written by Colonel Thomas Valrick, K. in November 1882, 6 days before his execution. It describes, in his own hand, the source material he was shown during his interrogation, including dates, handler names, and operational details." He looked at Croft with the mild attentiveness of a man who finds the situation genuinely unremarkable. "I believe the committee will find the dates illuminating, particularly in comparison to the dates on the document you've just been passed." Silence, not the silence of a Room that has paused. The silence of a room that has stopped. Sir Edmund looked at the letter. Then at the document in his hands. Then at Croft. Lord Croft's pleasant expression did not disappear. But it became, for the first time, effortful. Eleanor sat at the secondary table and breathed. She had known this was coming. She had placed the letter in the Duke's hands herself, had stood in that study and made the decision. She had known, in the abstract, what it would look like when it worked. She had not known it would feel like this, like something that had been pressing against her sternum for 5 years, slowly, incrementally, beginning to release. The dates are wrong. The committee would see it. They were seeing it now. In the way that Graves was holding both documents at arm's length and comparing them with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. Croft said something. His voice had lost its pleasant register. It had become something flatter and more careful. Eleanor didn't fully hear it. She was watching Sir Edmund Graves set both documents side by side on the tablecloth and say, quietly, to the man on his right, "We'll need the full committee for this." The dinner continued around them. A footman refilled glasses. Someone at the far end of the primary table laughed at something unrelated. The Duke did not look at her. He returned to his dinner with the composure of a man who had done what he came to do and was content to let it work without supervision. But under the table, hidden by the tablecloth and the particular geometry of where they were both seated, his hand moved on. See a brief, deliberate contact against the back of her chair, not a touch. An acknowledgement. She looked at her plate and let herself, for exactly 3 seconds, feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then the footman arrived with the next course, and she picked up her fork. And the dinner continued. On the carriage ride back, she was the one who broke the silence. "The dates," she said. "In the forged document. You knew they were wrong before tonight." "That I suspected." The letter confirmed it. "How long have you known about Croft specifically?" 14 months. He looked at the dark window. "I had suspicion for longer." Proof is a different standard. She absorbed this. 14 months. She had been in the Hartwell household, teaching Latin verbs and mending her second-best gloves. While he had been 14 months into the specific knowledge that the man who had built a false case around her father's name sat on the Intelligence Committee and attended the same dinners and smiled with that precise, practiced pleasantness. "You should have found me sooner," she said. "Yes." He said. "I should have." The carriage moved through the dark. "It's not finished," she said. Tonight was one dinner. Graves said they needed the full committee. "It's not finished." He agreed. "But it's different now than it was this morning. The letter is in evidence. The dates are on record. Croft can't make it disappear." He paused. "It will take time. But it will hold." She looked at her hands in her lap. The borrowed gloves were long gone. She had her own now, a plain pair. Serviceable. Her hands looked like her own hands again. "You said you would tell me everything," she said. "After tonight. Yes, that I am going to hold you to that. That I know," he said. "I expect nothing less." Outside the window, the manor gates appeared in the lamplight. They passed through them and the carriage slowed, and she thought about her packed traveling case upstairs, and about the letter that was no longer in its sewn pocket. And about the particular weight of a thing that had been set down after 5 years of carrying. She hadn't agreed to stay. She also hadn't gotten back into the carriage to London. She went upstairs without speaking further and sat on the edge of her bed and held her own hands in her lap for a long time, and thought about what it meant that for the first time in 5 years, she did not know exactly what she was going to do next. That it felt, unexpectedly, like something adjacent to freedom. The old man was waiting outside the manor gates the next morning. She nearly walked past him. He was sitting on the low stone wall that ran along the lane, dressed in the manner of someone who had once worn better clothes and had kept them carefully enough that the poverty of replacement was not immediately obvious. 70, perhaps. White-haired. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades handling paper, the particular calluses of an archivist. The ink shadow that never entirely leaves the right index finger. That he looked at her as she approached and said, without preamble, "You're the Valrick girl." She stopped. "That I worked for the Intelligence Archive for 31 years. He said. Before they retired me. A pause that contained a different word than retired. My name is Aldous Fenn. I knew your father. Not well was a field man and I was a file man. But I knew him enough to know he was not what they said. She looked at him. The lane was empty in both directions. The morning was cold and clear, the frost still on the grass. Why are you here? She said, because I've been watching what Blackwood has been doing for 2 years, Fenn said, and I think you don't know all of it yet. And I think you should. Before you decide anything, she sat down on the wall. Fenn had been the senior archivist in the Intelligence Records Office in 1882. He had processed the Valric file. He had noticed, at the time, 2 things that had troubled him enough that he had made a private notation in his personal records, not in the official file, which he understood was not entirely his to control. But in the small leather notebook he had kept for 31 years, the first was the chain of custody. 2 documents in the source package had arrived without the standard provenance notation. Someone had backfilled the notation. Latour could tell by the ink variation. A detail only an archivist of his experience would notice. The second was the young officer who had come to verify the file before submission. Gray-blue eyes. The kind of face that was already learning to give nothing away, though it hadn't quite finished learning that. He looked at those documents. Fenn said. He looked at them for a long time. Longer than verification required. And then he signed. He looked at his hands. I always thought he saw it. The ink variation. I always thought he saw it and signed anyway. Because the machine was already moving and he was 28 years old and the machine was larger than him. Eleanor sat on the cold stone wall and said nothing. That he came back to me 14 months ago. Fenn continued. Found me in my retirement in Bath. Sat in my kitchen for 3 hours and asked me every question he should have asked in 1882. A pause. I showed him the notation in my personal record. He sat with it for a long time. Fenn looked at her. Then he asked me if I still had the ink sample. From that period's archive. Did you? I'm an archivist. I have everything. A slight, dry expression. I gave him what I had. He used it to establish the forgery pattern. The same figure, same hand appears in 3 other cases from that period. All of them connected to Croft. Eleanor looked at the frost on the grass. The sun was beginning to work at it. Slowly. That he found me 2 months after he found you, Fenn said. He came back to Bath and told me he had located the letter, that it was in the possession of your father's daughter, that he was in the process of. Fenn paused, choosing his word. Establishing a situation in which the letter could be obtained. The word sat in the cold air. He also told me, Fenn said, more quietly, that it was not going the way he had planned. That it had become complicated. The old man looked at her with the directness of someone who had spent a career reading documents and understood that what was written and what was meant were not always the same thing. He didn't explain how. But I have been an archivist for 31 years. I can read a margin note. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. That he found me before he found you, she said. He came to you 14 months ago. And before that? He opened the Valric file again approximately 2 years ago. Fenn said. On his own time. Without committee authorization. Quietly enough that if anyone had found out, it would have cost him the directorship. He paused. He has been doing this for 2 years without telling anyone. Without being asked. Without. Fenn looked for the word. Any particular reason except that he knew the machine had made an error and he was part of the machine. The frost was almost gone now. The lane was still empty. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor said. Fenn stood up from the wall with the careful movement of a man whose joints had strong opinions about cold mornings. Because he want. He said simply. That type doesn't. He straightened his coat. And because your father was not what they said. And because the people who are not what they said deserve to have someone know the whole story. That he walked away down the lane. She sat on the wall and watched him go until he rounded the bend. And disappeared, And then she sat for a while longer in the cold morning and looked at the place where the frost had been. She found him in the library. He was at the far table, which she had not seen him use before. The desk in the study was his, but this table was neutral ground. A working surface rather than a position. Documents were spread across it in an arrangement that suggested several hours of prior work. He looked up when she entered. She closed the door, she crossed the room and stood at the opposite side of the table. And she looked at him across the spread of documents, some of which she recognized now, the shapes of files she had come to know in the past weeks. And she said, "Aldous Fenn came to see me this morning." Something moved across his face. Brief, controlled. But she had learned to read the fraction. "What did he tell you?" "That you opened the Valric file 2 years ago. Without authorization. Without being asked." She looked at him steadily. "That you went to him 14 months ago and spent 3 hours in his kitchen asking the questions you should have asked in 1882. That he was quiet. That he told me you sat with his nota tie-in for a long time," she said. "The ink variation. He said he always thought you saw it. In 1882. He thought you saw it and signed anyway." The library was very still. Outside, a bird. The distant sound of the house going about its morning. "Did you," she said, "see it?" That he looked at the documents on the table. "Then it heard that I saw something," he said. "I didn't know what it was. I told myself I was being overcautious. That the verification process was sound. That I had done my job." A pause. "I was 28 years old and the case was clean on its surface and your father had already confessed under interrogation and he stopped. I signed." She held that. "And then 6 men died," she said, "and then 6 men died. And I spent a year telling myself those were separate things. And then I stopped being able to tell myself that." She looked at the documents between them. At his hands resting at the table's edge. Still with the stillness she had come to associate with him thinking rather than with him withdrawing. "You've been doing this for 2 years, she said. Quietly. Without Fenn said without any particular reason except that you knew the machine had made an error. Fenn is generous, what would you say?" He was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it had taken on in the garden, before the sun came up, the quality of a door held open by effort rather than ease. "That I would say that I was very good at my work," he said. "And that I used that competence to sign a document that killed a man and destroyed his family, and that I then spent 3 years being very good at my work in other capacities. And that the being good at it stopped working as a substitution somewhere around the 2-year mark." He looked at her. "So I opened the file again." She was quiet for a long moment, then she reached into her coat pocket. The letter was no longer there, it was in evidence. In Gravis' possession now, and she found what she had taken instead, before leaving this morning. A folded piece of paper. The last page of her father's letter. The one she had copied out by hand 3 years ago in the Hartwell household kitchen at 2 in the morning because she had been afraid of losing the original and had needed something to keep. She unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. "He wrote about you," she said. "He didn't know your name. He described you." She watched his face. "He said, a young man came to take the last of the documents. Gray-blue eyes. He looked at me the way someone looks when they know the ending of a story and cannot say so. I found myself hoping that if he knew, he would not be able to live with knowing. I found myself hoping it would cost him something. I think perhaps it will." The silence that followed was the longest silence she had sat in since she came to Blackwood Manor. He read the words on the page. He read them again. He did not look up immediately. When he did, something in his face had changed in a way that was not performance and not control and not the careful management of expression she had watched him practice across every dinner table and drawing room for weeks. It was something underneath all of that. Something that had apparently been there since 1882, accruing interest. That he was right. Adrian said. It did. She looked at him across the table and the documents and the 5 years and the blue file and the 6 men and her father's 3 pages and all of it, whole accumulated weight of everything that had brought them both to this library on this particular morning. "That I know," she said. "That he came around the table. Not quickly, nothing he did was quick, he had the quality of someone who moved through the world as though haste was a form of imprecision. He stopped when there was still distance between them, close enough that she could see the grey blue of his eyes clearly. Far enough that the choice of what happened next remained entirely hers. That I found you because I needed the letter, he said. That was true. And then I found you. And it became. He stopped. Looked for the word with the precision of someone who did not use words carelessly. Something else became true at the same time. And I did not handle that well. No, she said. You didn't. That I am not. A pause. The effort held door again. Wider now than she had seen it. I am not certain I know how to do this. I have spent a considerable number of years being very competent at things that do not require me to. He looked at her. I don't know how to do this without being certain of the outcome first. And I am not certain of the outcome. She thought about the carriage. The first day. I don't want to lie to you. The garden at dawn. The dinner table. Eleanor Valrick. The study at midnight. Yes. I should have. She thought about her father writing, in his last 3 pages. About grey-blue eyes that knew the ending and could not say so. That I am not certain either, she said. I think that might be the point. That he looked at her. A long moment. The confirming quality again, the quality she had first seen in the church. Which she now understood was not calculation but something that had no better word than recognition. Your father's name will be cleared, he said. The committee will have the full case within the month. That is separate from everything else. That is not conditional. That I know. She said. I know it's separate. That I wanted you to know that I know it's separate. That I know that too. The morning light came through the library windows in long pale columns and landed on the documents between them and on his hands at the table's edge and on the copy of her father's last words lying open on the table, and she thought about the fountain in the garden and the frost on the grass and the particular shape of what it felt like to put something down after carrying it for 5 years. You owe me everything you declined to tell me. She said. All of it. In order, yes, that will take some time. That I have time. He said. If you're willing to stay while I use it. She looked at him. At the grey-blue eyes her father had looked at across a desk in 1882 and found worth writing about with 3 pages and the last of his ink. That I am willing to stay, she said. Outside. The frost was gone entirely. The lane was clear and cold and bright, and somewhere in the garden the fountain was still dry and full of leaves. And she thought that in the spring someone should probably clear them out. She thought she might still be here in the spring. The thought settled in her chest like something coming to rest after a very long time in motion. She reached out and picked up the copy of her father's letter from the tab. Lo, and she folded it along its original creases, and she put it back in her pocket. Then she sat down across from him, and he sat down across from her, and he began finally, fully, in order to tell her everything.